Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for attending tonight's talk, hosted by Archizoom, and is a part of the program of Sometimes Doing Nothing Leads to Something. Thank you also to Marson, Korbi, for returning to give his second talk for the program. Marson is currently at the Lab of History and Theory 3, LTH. He is an architect from Albania who, in his own words, is a Bowian absolute beginner, whose research and design interests are a continuous attempt to escape from the disciplinary cornices of architecture, struggling against precariousness and hierarchical life exploitation, which I feel is very appropriate for tonight's talk. To quote our last esteemed guest speaker, who stated that the one single commodity most vied for by companies today is our attention, it is very fitting that this talk tonight is entitled Daydreaming and Boredom, from the chaise-longue to the childhood bedroom. I'm told, and I'm very looking forward to hear, that the lecture will focus on a particular form of doing nothing, that is daydreaming, an activity that seems apparently lost as a ritual in contemporary capitalism and everyday habits, presented from the point of view of childhood from the 19th century to today. Children in total boredom, which I know very well, children in moments of joy and playing, and children who had quickly become adults. Contextualizing all of this will be the domestic sphere of the family home, with particular focus on the rise and fall of the chaise-longue as the most emblematic object of doing nothing, object of nothing doing, doing nothing. And the passage to the cameretta, the children's bedroom in the parents' house. So without further ado, I will pass the word to Marson.
I will share my screen now. So thank you, Teresa. Thank you again to the Archizoom team. I really have to be honest, making a presentation after the last presentation of Brian, apparently seems a very, very hard task. So I will try to do my best, and especially I will try to do this lecture Nothing But Boredom, which is also the title of it. And so I can start. The lecture is about, as Teresa was saying, a particular form of doing nothing, which is the dreaming, that I will explain it. First of all, I would like to focus a little bit a specific episode, which is an episode also related to this object that is a very emblematic object to the relation of doing nothing, that is a chaise-longue. In 1618, La Marquise Catherine de Rambouillet, she was moving from the court and go and live in the center of Paris in this hotel, which later became Hotel de Rambouillet, and which was a building between, let's say, the Tuileries Gardens and Le Louvre. She left the court because she had enough about the court life, all the gossips, all the intrigues, and all the difficulties to being, let's say, subsumed and, let's say, under the hierarchical forms of living that were the one of the court. So basically she wanted to emancipate, to create a form of emancipation from this kind of living. And she moved in this hotel, and secondly, she took one of the most, let's say, generic room, which was a very simple and let's say lofty room that was called the Chambre Bleue, because of the colors of the paintings, of the carpets, of the wallpapers, which are basically totally blue. And she decided to transform this room in a sort of, let's say, collective room that was becoming suddenly the room that was also could be considered as a sort of precursor of the typical French saloon of the 19th century, basically. Unfortunately, I couldn't find an image of this. Okay, sorry, I had this problem with the screen, but apparently and unfortunately, I couldn't find an image of the original room. But of course, this is a...
Marson, you're not sharing.
Sorry, I don't know what happened, but I will try to share it again.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, unfortunately, I said that I couldn't find an image of the original room, but this is an image of, let's say, of the 19th century of a typical saloon in Paris, which basically shows how and creates also an idea of how the blue chambre that Madame Rambouillet created in this hotel, which was basically a room full of objects. But the most important one, the chaise-longue, starts to appear in the public sphere as a sort of, let's say, occupying the central part of the room. In the chaise-longue, Madame Rambouillet used it to rest on it, and also to receive guests. It is possible to imagine this space full of people at a certain point where Madame de Rambouillet was basically lying on her bed, on her, let's say, day bed, on this chaise-longue. And then all around the room, all the guests were also trying to speak and talk with each other, and to also talk with her. It is possible to imagine her, let's say, waiting for different guests who basically also took their turn in order to speak with her. It was possible to speak in this kind of room, but for everything, that was, let's say, at the time trying to create a sort of, let's say, social life in the urban fabric of Paris, something that also was a sort of, let's say, precursor of what later will become the club of literature. So many of these conversations that took place in this space were about, let's say, intellectual aspect of urban life, about politics, about, as I said, literature and art, everything but gossips and all this kind of stuff that Madame de Rambouillet tried to escape from the court. So this is why I also try to say that this is sort of, let's say, a project of emancipation, of domestic emancipation. And I really try to, it is also possible to say that to a certain way, this room reassembled to me also the silver factory of Andy Warhol, no? Where at a certain point the sofa becomes the main, let's say, element, the main furniture element of the room. And in a certain way, you have to imagine this as a sort of silver factory room, where all this part of the bourgeoisie society of Paris, of the aristocracy, and also of the upper middle class were occupying it. Staying in this period, basically, and quoting a very interesting, let's say, sentence of Siegfried Gideon in his Mechanization Takes Command, the 19th century basically becomes a period where the official posture, or the, let's say, main posture, was also the posture of relaxation. So basically, it is possible, according to Gideon, that relaxation was found in a free and pose attitude that can be called neither sitting nor lying. And this was also an aspect that was depicted by many painters of the time, where the sofa, or also the posture of relaxing, was a sort of protagonist of the way people used to live, and of the main habits that were concerning especially the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the upper middle class of the time. And especially, as I said, the daybed or the chaise-longue becomes the, let's say, the scenography for this way of, for this new habit, no? As Gideon also highlights, in comparison, for example, to the Middle Ages, where the painting, where the protagonists of the posture of paintings were really, let's say, related to a sort of, let's say, very, very random, represented as a sort of, let's say, very messy. You see in the Middle Ages paintings these people hanging around and doing different stuff. So there is not a specific posture in Middle Ages. And what happens, for example, in Renaissance, according to Gideon, is more related to a posture where the frontal portrait, or where the really imposted posture was, let's say, the official way of being in a painting. And this change of, let's say, habit, where relaxing become, let's say, a form of doing nothing, but at the same time also a form of, let's say, staying within domestic space, was starting to be a sort of obsession for many painters of the time. And in fact, it is possible to collect a lot of paintings when as I said, the daybed and the chaise-longue becomes the scenography for this form of staying in the house. Of course, this presentation is not related to a sort of, let's say, categorization of all the shapes that the chaise-longue take during the time. There could be different interpretations, different, let's say, forms related to how the way the chaise-longue took shape. But what I was trying to concentrate today is more related to this idea and this specific form of staying in the house, which personally I find that in the book of The Poetic of Space of Gaston Bachelard, we can find a very, let's say, specific and precise definition on what is this activity that today I call daydreaming. Basically, daydreaming is, according to Bachelard, is a sort of privilege of auto-valorization. It derives direct pleasure from its own being. The places in which we have experienced daydreaming reconstitute themselves in a new daydream, and it is because of our memories of former dwelling places are relived as daydreams that these dwelling places of the past remain in us for all the time. So what is basically Gaston Bachelard trying to say is that it is through this habit or this activity of the daydreaming that is also possible to establish a sort of experience with domestic space. And it is precisely in the way this act occurs, especially as a sort of doing nothing, where what the guy who's daydreaming basically was also thinking to the activities that he used to do, the habits that he used to do in the formal dwellings that he used to inhabit. At a certain point, it is interesting, for example, in this other quotation, that the house we were born, it is more than an embodiment of home. It is also an embodiment of dreams. Each one of its nooks and corners was a resting place for daydreaming. The house, the bedroom, the garret in which we were alone, furnished a framework for an interminable dream. So what a beautiful expression to use for an interminable dream, which means basically that all this experience, especially as in childhood, that we also make in the first place when we used to live, the way, for example, we used to climb stairs, our first stairs, or the way we used to move from one room to the other, or the way we used to open the door to a certain aspects, create a sort of habits that really creates a scenography for life, even for future daydreamings. And this one, this quote in particular, is the one that really made me to think about what does it mean to daydream and how it could be this way for the description and in order to understand domestic life. So here Bachelard says, what a special depth that there is in a child's daydream, no? And how happy the child who really possesses moments of solitude. So there is also a moment related to solitude, to being alone. It is a good thing. It is even salutary for a child to have periods of boredom. There are children who will leave a game to go and be bored in a corner of the garret, center of boredom, center of solitude, centers of daydream grouped together to constitute the oniric house, which is more lasting than the scattered memories of our birthplace. So in fact, this relation to childhood, to daydreaming, really explains how this activity could be very easily connected to this part of our life. where basically the home, the domestic space, is totally experienced, no, from all this, in all its angles, in all its parts. But what is interesting, as I said, in relation to the fact that, according to Gideon, if on the one hand, let's say, the posture of relaxing, of laying in this chaise-longue was, let's say, becoming the official posture of the 19th century, on the other hand, the idea of, let's say, of the 19th century, according to Philippe Ayres in his book Centuries of Childhood, he argues that the 19th century, or basically, to say it in better words, for Philip Ayres, every century, every period in history have a specific relation to childhood and to age, basically. For example, during the Middle Ages, children were, let's say, especially boys, were, let's say, used to be treated as little men. In the 17th century, according to Ayres, the privileged age for that period was basically youth. And coming back, turning back or going forward, basically in the 19th century, childhood becomes the most important age of this period. And in fact, it is curious when I try to make this little research and to understand if daydreaming was depicted. There were a lot of paintings of this period where this idea of the daydreaming, there were a lot of paintings basically depicting always children or women staying in this in a sofa or in a daybed, in a chaise-longue, which are basically depicted in this kind of position when the glance is totally lost. You know, you can see the eyes here; they are not focused on a specific point. They just they seem to disappear somehow, no? Because what is specifically depicted is this profound moment of daydreaming, of being alone and thinking about of the interior, no, of this kind of, let's say, memories of places visited or dwelled before, as Bachelard tries to say to us as well. And thus, I would make this parenthesis, turning back for a while to this definition of Ayres, who says that in Middle Ages, basically, but even in different societies and also in different times, there are a lot of examples when basically the child, especially children, especially boys, were treated as little men. So I wanted to put this example, which is for me even an example that even when I was myself a child, I was also thinking a lot. These images are related to a movie in Albania in the 80s called treated from a novel of the Albanian writer Andon Zako Chayupi that writes this novel, which is basically entitled Bridgeroom at 14 age, which is talking about the guy who has to be married when he has 14 years old. And this becomes a movie in 1997 by film director Dimitar Anagnosti, who basically tries to so we have to understand also the context. We are in the very middle of socialist realism in Albania, so there is also an attack, a sort of propaganda attack towards religion, in this case towards Catholic Orthodox, where the movie and also the novel is contextualized. So basically, as I said, there is this guy who is 14 years old, and his family decide for him to be married in his age and with this girl which is older than him. As you also might see from this scene of the film, she is 20 years old, so 6 years older than him. And the film is a sort of, let's say, a sort of parody and also a sort of grotesque parody of what was supposed to be urban society in Albania during before communism, basically, where people were really related to religion. families especially was a very fundamental institution in the same way as religion was. So this idea of men, once they were able to speak and also mature enough, even they didn't reach the age of maturity. They were able to become husbands. They were already able to become the man of the house. And the grotesque part of the film, of course, is when this, let's say, this really young girl, which has 20 years old, at a certain point, instead of being a wife, basically she becomes a sort of more an educator than a wife, more a mother than a wife, more a servant for her family. And in fact, the film is also related to this topic, which during the Albanian socialism was related to the emancipation of women with all the problematics from the point of view of the ideology and the historical ideology of the time. This is, by the way, also the main room of the Albanian traditional house, where on the upper part there is let's say this the way where men gather together in this room, which is called the sofa, and when the bridge comes inside the room, she basically becomes a servant of the family and of the parents. So I try to basically put this parenthesis in order also to understand that there were some periods in our history, in our also recent history, when a child was already treated as an adult. And these images for me are important because really show how this, let's say, was even in a material term, even in a form of representation. Of course, we have reached a sort of emancipation from this kind of, let's say, situations. But it's still important to have also a view and also to imagine how our past, let's say, history was, even in terms of social relationships and in relation to children. Going back to the very subject of this part of the lecture, which is actually this first part of the lecture, the chaise-longue start also, apart from its public role, starts to have a very private role, especially when it becomes a fixed furniture somehow, a furniture that never misses, let's say, like this in the house. For example, in this case, we see a chaise-longue in a bedroom, which is a very interesting fact as we imagine it from the point of view of our times, because it is more or less impossible to see a chaise-longue today in our homes, and even more impossible to imagine a chaise-longue within a typical bedroom. To a certain, let's say, from a specific point of view, this fact, the idea that there is a chaise-longue, there is a place of doing nothing, of daydreaming, which doesn't belong neither to sleeping nor to writing or to sitting in a chair. It's a certain way, from the point of view of contemporary times, even a very, let's say, provocative act, because it tries to say that the bedroom could be used even for other activities that probably today are being lost. And in fact, in Search for Lost Time, in Marcel Proust's bedroom, when Marcel Proust at the beginning of the 20s started to write his very famous novel, his bedroom becomes suddenly a place where daydreaming, as also Walter Benjamin has highlighted in his essay on Marcel Proust, becomes the daydreaming Marcel Proust, the very leitmotiv, or let's say the most important activity, which was also the most important, let's say, aspect that made him write his novel. Because, as also Walter Benjamin argues and also highlights, in order for Proust to write his novel, the act of daydreaming, the act of thinking of the past, of collecting all these memories or collecting all these, let's say, past childhood moments of life and depicting them in his contemporary times by making also transformations and also alteration to the stories. The act of the daydreaming was a fundamental part of his life, especially when he had to write. And in fact, it's not by chance that we see a chaise-longue. We see again a chaise-longue in a bedroom. And this chaise-longue also is part of his way of living his room, which is totally reversed in compared to the way we live in a bedroom. Basically, Marcel Proust was working during the night and he slept during the day. So this is why, and we can also understand the use of these black curtains, these black séparés and blankets, because he was also trying to avoid natural light. And at a certain point, of course, moving from the bed to the sofa to the chaise-longue becomes a fundamental part of his, let's say, activity of daydreaming, especially with the chaise-longue for writing this most important oeuvre. Going back from the house, the chaise-longue, especially during the middle of the 19th century, becomes a very, let's say, somehow it's possible to say a sort of, let's say, mass industrial object, especially because of this terrificant fact, which is let's say the appearance of the tuberculosis disease in Europe, specifically, where there is a sort of, let's say, a very problematic aspects for many states, for many countries. Many people were dying during the middle of the 19th century. And it was an urgent, resembling somehow also contemporary times, to build hospitals and to build care centers. And it is for this reason that in many countries, like in Switzerland, in Germany, and also in England, they were starting to build sanatorium. And this sanatorium becomes a place where these, let's say, tuberculosis people with tuberculosis has to be cared. And has to be taken care, and to be taken care in fresh air, in the middle of, let's say, idylliacal places. But this is not for a pictorial point of view. This is because the main cure noticed at the time was a very, let's say, domestic cure. Basically, it was possible to think on curating people from tuberculosis only by putting them in these terraces and putting them in the reclining position, which is a position that at the moment the chaise-longue could allow to put these people. Basically, the idea of being in a reclined position could allow fresh air and also natural air to reach and to breathe better somehow in a time where tuberculosis were very, let's say, aggressive illness somehow. And for this reason, the development of the chaise-longue becomes a kind of, let's say, political obsession, because it has to be produced not anymore for domestic purposes, but it has to be for medical use. It has to be produced for medical use. We can understand, as I also try to say in this circumstance, also the spread of different sanatoriums in different parts of Europe until the discovery of the cure, which was discovered, if I'm not wrong, in 1950s. During that time, the sanatoria was a building which is totally dedicated to this kind of problem. And for example, in the case of Alvaralto Sanatorium in Paimio, Alvaralto really tries to effort, apart from the building, also to start thinking furniture, even in relation to this, let's say, idea of comfort and to this idea of care. In many of these drawings, many of these attempts were related to making this object feel as domestic as possible, and avoiding also all these, let's say, very mechanical, fashion-like, and all these metallic elements that were produced during that time. So this idea is really wanted to produce an element which was really trying to give to these people also the idea of being at home somehow. And it is interesting that in this case, if we talk about this disease, if we talk about this problem, which was a sort of global problem somehow, it is interesting to notice that the idea of the daydreaming, which is apparently been lost, but the chaise-longue becomes an element to another form more or less of doing nothing, which is this inactivity to work. When you are ill, basically, you are inactive. And this is, let's say, something that it couldn't be possible for a typical national state to have people who cannot work. And this is, for example, also problematic in contemporary times, but it was even much more, let's say, highlighted in that period where labor power was the capacity of the set of physical and intellectual attitudes which exist in the body and in the living personality of men were basically put in crisis through this disease. So the alteration that also Gideon highlights according to medical use of the chaise-longue was also related to a sort of mechanization, literally to a mechanization of this element at a certain point, even because of the many other diseases, even because of to a certain idea of comfort, the chaise-longue was starting to become a more mechanized element, which could also allow the organization of different possibility of the body, of lying, which is not only a daydreaming moment anymore, but is something also related to different ways of being in the house. And in fact, there are also some other, let's say, alterations allowed through these possibilities that made possible mechanization of the time to use it more for an otium. Moments of living, to use it also for reading a book in the middle of a garden, which are very, let's say, bourgeoisie forms of living, and go a little bit towards this kind of commodification of this domestic object to a certain point. But there is also another moment that needs to be highlighted and also to be recalled a little bit for this very close relation that the daydreaming has with the chaise-longue as a domestic object, and also with the childhood. Freud, in a very little and interesting essay, which is entitled "Creative Writers and Daydreaming," argues that basically the daydreaming, or to be a little bit more precise, he talks about childhood and what happens with child in the moment, especially when they play. They are able to manifest it. So for a child, the idea of playing, of creating, let's say, roles, of this idea of aiming to be an adult as soon as possible, is not hidden, is basically visible. So child really tend to reconstruct this kind of world around them, and they have no problems for manifesting it, as I said. On the other hand, adults, according to Freud always, they transform, when they grown up, these moments of playing in something else, which basically becomes fantasies and daydreaming. Freud says these fantasies could be, for men, it's impossible to tell them to others. And in fact, in the 20s, it was possible to know that fantasies existed only through mental disease people, because they were let's say, forced by their doctors to tell them which were their fantasies. So according to Freud, it is this precise fact that allow us to know today that everybody of us has somehow fantasies. And these fantasies, daydreamings basically, could be related to erotic dreamings, for example, could be related to this idea of being, having, let's say, a sort of, let's say, improvement in the job, or having a sort of success in life, etc., etc. But what is interesting, and which is the point that Freud uses even as part of his, let's say, methodological work, is that basically in daydreaming, as also Gaston Bachelard tries to highlight, people create these sort of scenarios that they capture from the past, from the childhood. And they project them, or let's say better, they keep them and they bring them in the present time. So their wishes, which are related to wishes of the concrete moment of the actuality, then are being projected and are being projected in a future as wishes. No? So they really take these places from the past and retransform them for making for creating a sort of wish. And this is precisely this kind of wish that for Freud is what becomes real in the job of writers. Writers, especially the writers of novels, as Marcel Proust, they really take moments from their past, re-elaborate them, and try to project them in the future through this idea of the writing. This passage, I think, is very interesting because opens up a more, let's say, precise, or let's say specifies a more precise definition of the daydreaming, which is not only the idea of being in a chaise-longue with the eyes totally lost in the air, but is something that really is a sort of intellectual thinking somehow. And in fact, as I said, on the one hand, this is more visible when we see children playing, and this starts to disappear in adult life. But staying for a little bit on the children, let's say, moments, or the children of, let's say, of the domestic space from the point of view of children, during, let's say, the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, there were a lot of treatises and a lot of, let's say, architecture books trying to describe how the perfect domestic space of the bourgeoisie and the middle class could be. No? And in this one, which is a book written by Nicolas de Camus de Mézières in 1780, he really tries to give some guidelines how the apartment, specifically the part of the apartment of the children could be. So we shall distinguish two apartments, that of the boys. So two apartments, he means that we are talking still inside one apartment, which is the family home apartment that is divided by other parts, which he calls here, let's say, apartments in this term. And basically we shall distinguish two apartments, that of the boys and that of the young ladies. Until they reach the age of 5, all the children are kept together with a governess and a maid servant. They require 5 rooms: an anteroom, a large room for exercise, a bedroom large enough to contain the necessary bed, and another for wardrobes and linen, and the 5th for the maid servant. It would be also an advantage to have a closet well lit and well aired, to all the closest tools and the press for the soiled linen. So basically, it's also trying to give let's say, an organization of how this separation of children from their parents could be. Because in the bourgeoisie home of the 19th century, the parents' part of the house has to be separated from them of the children. When they are still young, they could still sleep together. And after a certain let's say, age, they have to be subdivided. What is interesting from this subdivision of the house is that to the children, there is someone else who is totally dedicated to them, which is this servant, the nursery. The nursery part becomes really a place in the home, within the home. And there is this woman who really takes a salary for taking care of the children of this family, of a typical family. This is how the way it was already organized in the home. But what I was also trying to read is that these guidelines trying to make it as let's say, as something to be standardized, no, as something that could be always like this. So there was the part, as I said, of the children, which was totally subdivided or totally separated from the part of the parents. And there was the servant who was taking care of these children through and was paid with a specific salary for doing this kind of job. Even play, studying, and all these activities that are typically related to children were, let's say, each of these has its specific space in the room. Especially from a contemporary point of view, it is interesting that the study room of the house was separated from the bedroom, from the place of sleeping, basically. Then going, let's say, more projected in the most famous chaise-longue ever designed, which is the chaise-longue of Le Corbusier, that appears in its most intense and powerful expressive design and aesthetic in the Salon d'Automne in 1929, through this, let's say, change or transformation that Le Corbusier was passing through an attention that was previously directed only to single element and furnitures in the house. At the end of, let's say, 20s, he starts to speak about equipments, no? And the chaise-longue, as well as the club chair, and also the other equipments and all the elements that we can see in the Salon d'Automne installation, the furniture becomes part of an entire equipment. And when basically Charlotte Perriand reaches the studio of the office of Le Corbusier, she designs what we know as this rotating chaise-longue. And she makes also this very interesting, that for Le Corbusier was something new, this collage, which the chaise-longue appears as something that occupies the very center of the space. So the idea of having this very huge lofty space, the typical bedroom or the typical domestic space somehow has been transformed. And the chaise-longue starts to appear and to become the sort of, let's say, protagonist of the main living room of the house. Of course, the idea of having a living room in the house, a chaise-longue in the living room, in the center of the living room, was not something invented by Le Corbusier. But what is interesting is the idea of how Le Corbusier, in all these sketches in different proposals of villas, puts this element in the very center of the house. Many times the house is depicted, this lofty living room or this lofty part of the house is depicted as totally empty, where the only protagonist is the chaise-longue, which stays as a diamond, as a diamante grezzo, in the very middle of the house. This obsession of Le Corbusier for reclining posture, and also for the study of the different forms of using furniture, and the study for the different forms of posture, is something really known. And in fact, what is interesting from my point of view is his real obsession of how the chaise-longue could be shaped. No? This idea of depicting always this sinusoidal element of the man reclining in the chaise-longue is very recurrent on his work, especially when he was trying to understand which could be the most effective form for the chaise-longue. In fact, this kind of, let's say, obsession, which also was trying to keep the chaise-longue as a more transforming, if you think about it, is also trying to transform the chaise-longue, which becomes always more detached from this idea, this activity of daydreaming. It becomes suddenly a more fetishistic element, and to a certain point, even a genius and even a very, let's say, interesting example of this element. Le Corbusier is one of those who contributes to really detach these elements and to make it as a sort of, let's say, element to be contemplated and not an element to contemplate on it. In fact, this appearance of this element, which becomes basically a form, now has lost its value as a furniture, and it becomes this more or less a form to be emphasized, to be part of the project, of the architectural project itself, really, in my opinion, determines a sort of, let's say, detachment of the chaise-longue from the daydreaming act. Another figure, which is a contemporary somehow to Le Corbusier, which is a very controversial painter, but I think is a painter that really understood the problem of childhood and really tried to understand and also to elaborate something which is really crucial in the childhood, in the way children are used to live domestic space. In Balthus, L'Enfant Blanchard, where his famous muse, Teresa, which is the girl lying on the ground and doing her homework, that becomes his muse also for his most, let's say, famous paintings. And her brother in the studio of Balthus in Paris really tries to give, even in the way Balthus wants to represent them, the idea that childhood is something totally related to boring. It is only through childhood, which is a very, let's say, fast moment if you consider our contemporary times. Childhood is something that goes on really fast. And what Balthus tried to do in his work, in his most famous work, is really to capture this moment, is really to stop time to a certain extent. And it was to represent this idea of boredom, this idea of rebellion, which is typical of adolescents, for example, if you consider the age of these two children in this image. He really wants to take and to understand which is how is it possible to see domestic space from a point of view of such an innocent, let's say, of such an innocent point of view, and how is it possible to narrate it. And in fact, the idea of stopping time, the idea of focusing on this idea of this activity of daydreaming could be probably understood, especially with Balthus, as one of the last moments that when the daydreaming becomes in our own society, in our imagination, as an activity that could be also part of our domestic space. So what is interesting, the thing that Balthus is interested is this idea of waiting. So the idea that children are educated to wait, basically, even in the game that Freud tries to understand and to narrate, that the children, even when they play a game which is related to how to be like adults, basically. And what Balthus tried to do is really to stop this moment. So this idea of having long afternoons, of doing nothing, still only growing time, which is something that Balthus takes from the German poet Rilke, really explains his work from this point of view. And of course, to a certain extent, the sort of revival of the chaise-longue, which has already disappeared. We are in the 40s. But in these paintings, for example, Balthus, I think that has a lot of commons in Le Corbusier, his obsession for this kind of posture, which is not a traditional or a very common posture in the way we stay at home. And he also is a posture that he observes in children. He really becomes obsessed, actually, by this kind of laying in this in the chaise-longue, in the sofa or in the armchair. And if you have a look to many of these paintings, this kind of laying, this very strange position, really is a recurrent, is an obsession. And to a certain extent, really reminds me, for example, how Le Corbusier was obsessively drawing the shape of the chaise-longue in all his sketches. The fall of the chaise-longue and the daydreaming, it is possible to argue that coincides with the rise of the family discipline and the existential minimum ideology. During the 20s of the 20th century, basically, we can understand or we can argue that there is a sort of disappearance of the daydreaming, as I also try to say through the Bachelard. But on the other hand, there is another value that tries to be more, let's say, important, that starts to be more important, which is the idea of Beruf, the German word used to describe profession. But basically, Beruf from German means both calling in a sort of vocation, in vocation, in sense of religion, in a sort of religious sense, and also profession, referring basically to the job. In fact, in the definition that Max Weber gives to this word, he says that basically the idea of one's duty in a calling is what is most characteristic of the social ethic of capitalistic culture, and is in a sense the fundamental basis of it. it is an obligation which the individual is supposed to feel and thus feel towards the content of his professional activity. So what Weber is saying is at a certain point, the idea of working, the idea of being a professional becomes, it is embodied in the ideology, in the discipline of the family life. Parents and children, and also the idea that parents have to educate and to push these children to be, to have a futuristic career as a white collar, as a self-made man, as a brilliant professional in the future. So all these kind of values that we take for granted in the way we live, also in our relation, basically even to our parents, is something that really starts to emerge in this period. And in fact, this image is for me one of the as many images of the many prototypes of the existential minimum examples really explains how this, let's say, the domestic space is reducing, and also the idea of putting in crisis any possibility for being at home without doing nothing, basically. In fact, Karel Teige, who is a Czechoslovakian poet and also architectural critic, is the one who really understands what was the existential minimum experiments. Teige, who was very critic to the second Cheung in Frankfurt, he says that what basically the architects of the second Cheung were doing was just proposing the bourgeoisie ways of life, squeezed or redacted only in space, and by proposing certain forms of living and certain ways of life which are inappropriate to what was the working class and the middle class of the 20s. And in fact, in this diagram, this is a very interesting diagram that Teige shows in his book, The Minimum Dwelling, which basically compares the difference of the house and the use of the house. And it is very interesting how the dwelling of the proletariat or the working class of the 20s has been transformed to a place to be used only for sleeping at night, basically, considering all the time passed at work, in the factory, at school, etc., etc. And in fact, Teige really wants to bring back a new idea of house where the daydreaming could be possible, to argue that it was really could be found in the way he makes his collage really very interesting and surrealistic in this combination between female nude and landscape. But at the same time, also the use, his critique to the way the domestic space were also reducing the use of the house as a place where woman was also becoming a sort of servant, as someone whose task was only related to kitchen, to the education of children. And let's say, apart from this, Teige wanted really to make a sort of revival to a certain extent to this idea of living and to daydreaming. And in fact, the use of this female nude becomes a fundamental element for his version of the minimum dwelling. Teige's version, minimum dwelling, is not a reduction of the already existing apartment, but is the idea that everybody could use and could have a single room. And all these aspects of life that could be collectivized and centralized could be collectivized easily, basically. So what Teige was trying to predict the idea of returning to the single room, to what the Italian word cameretta, which is a sort of mini bedroom, little bedroom, used to refer, especially from the point of view of childhood, so from the point of view of daughters and sons, so inside the typical family apartment. What Teige was basically criticizing, it was also what in reality becomes concrete, especially when we take a comparison in this taxonomy, as also I try to do all the different, let's say, rooms and the children's bedrooms in many of the apartments, family apartments that at the time was also being proposed by many architects in the existence minimum exhibition. And we also try to compare them with each other, as I also try to do. It was a really funny, let's say, moment of this research to understand, to capture only the child bedroom, children's bedroom from these houses, and to put on them some furniture. It was really interesting to see how this minimum, how minimum this space is, and how it has been reduced. If you put, for example, as it was supposed to be, many of them, only two beds and one common desk, or two separate desks, the spaces that remains for doing nothing is basically zero. And there is also no space for putting an eventual chaise-longue in a certain way. Also, if somebody wants to rebring a sort of Marcel Proust way of living in this kind of houses. And in fact, what was the ideology promoted by the existential minimum? It was what in reality happened if we think to the many housing, to the many social housing projects after the World War II. This image, for example, which is for me very emblematic of a shared bedroom between a brother and a sister, which really shows how the family home, especially from the point of view of children, of daughter and son in this case, becomes a place of, let's say, extreme discipline, where it's even impossible to close, to create a sort of, let's say, retirement from the discipline of the family. It becomes a place which is totally on control, totally depending from parents' economy, as we might know, from parents' discipline, etc., etc. And in fact, it is also interesting if we catch today, especially nowadays, all the different bedrooms or these camerette, the way these have been transformed with the recent, let's say, ways that the family somehow, the nuclear family, is being reduced to a certain point, or is already starting a little bit to suffer from certain, let's say, situations like precariousness, flexibility at work, the idea of mobility, of having to change, all these social aspects that today somehow could be really easily understood if we have a look to all this, to all the rooms, former camerette or former children bedrooms that today are rented in the market of student apartments or etc. And it is interesting that all these former dwellings, all these former rooms were once upon a time used as children's bedroom, basically. So also the idea that the house becomes more a place for working, which in these times of pandemic we know very well. And of course, for me, especially having to think on the idea of laying on a sofa and daydreaming is almost impossible, considering the amount of work, the amount of preciseness, and that the idea that we have to be connected all the time exposes us. So it is basically impossible to think in this kind of moment, at least when maybe many of us does, or some others, let's say, conduct a more ascetic, a rigid form of life, where they decide to avoid the use of smartphones before going to sleep. The idea of daydreaming is totally been, as also Brian probably tried to say to us, by this capturing of attention from all these technological aspects. So daydreaming in where, no? In the coercitive place called the marital bed, in the student shared apartment, before going to sleep, scrolling of cat videos, Facebook and Instagram stories, in that orgy of WhatsApp groups where there is always somebody ordering what you do the next morning and somebody else stalking your last access. In that violent place, which is the city, its terroristic indifference, and all these problems related to competitors, friends, sexual and euphoric hypocrisy. And of course, how is it possible to consider in such probably scenario of contemporary life living as an actor? Probably, no? Why don't we feel like living in a play? Some already play roles, invent self-personalities, always a new personality. Some others already play a certain role at home, another at work, another in bed. Someone smiles, someone else smiles fakely. Someone fakes to be gentle and kind, and someone else it is also for real. So play, a lifelong Shakespeareism play like an eternal child or a child for life. This is maybe a question to understand if it's still possible to be like a child forever. And thus, I will conclude with this passage, which is a poem of William Shakespeare, where basically all the words on stage, according to Shakespeare, is a moment where we born as a child, as children, and we grow up. So, like he also, I try to highlight in the central part of the poem, the sixth age, shift into the lean and slippers pantaloon, and then for his shank, and his big manly voice turning again toward the childish treble pipes. So his second childiness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans size, sans dance, sans everything. So is it possible to think of being a child forever? This is my question, and I would like to thank you for your attention and also for this moment of boredom.
Wow, thank you, Marson, for this incredibly expansive talk that touched upon so many incredible references and a really wonderful narrative, bringing them together. May I pose your final question back to you? It was something that occurred to me because all through your talk, I was wondering why, I mean, of course, you also highlighted some of the reasons, but I feel like we are really lacking this ability to accept from many different levels, whether they are personal, economical, or related to kind of a social structure, really kind of negating or making the notion of idleness or purposelessness, something that is seen to be bad or unproductive. And I was really wondering that, why I have children, one is 7, one is 4, and the 4-year-old just daydreams the whole day, every day, in as many opportunities as he can. And whenever I have guests around, or used to have guests around, they would marvel at him because all he does is run around making explosion noises endlessly. And he is just somewhere in his own world and feels very violated when we interrupt him. And in fact, the only way I can disturb him is to actually touch him to really bring him back to me. So yeah, I kind of wanted to pose this, your own question back to you in a sense of, can we bring back that kind of notion of seeing things for the first time and through daydreaming, bringing scenarios together, but also that the notion of being idle and doing things for no purpose can maybe have a way of returning to us to bring back a certain kind of joie de vivre to how we are living these days.
Yeah, it's a nice question. I mean, it's also very difficult to answer. I mean, the idea of today, the idea of staying purposeless. I also try. I mean, during this period of COVID, we are all probably exposed to this way of living or forced to this way of living, and personally I also try to have some moments of boredom, and I really make me afraid, the idea of nothing to do, of what could I find. I was also in the search of doing something, reading and writing or drawing or making projects or talking with our collective or whatever. It was to a certain point, to a certain extent, we are probably so used to to think about something and so engaged that probably it seems so impossible to think of erasing any, let's say, objective or any aim or any, let's say, personal of stop doing things, basically, which is but for me, from a point of view of this idea of which is also you, Teresa, say when you talk about your children, that they have a lot of moments of daydreaming. I really think that I really would like to be in their position sometimes. And this is why what I also try to question, and probably it could be more of my, let's say, research of this research, if I would try to also to extend it. What I'm interested in, also what I would try to understand, if it's true on the one hand that during the Middle Ages, during, let's say, even in different times and different centuries, to build different relations and to consider even the division between children and adults. Let's say, for example, in Middle Ages, the maturity or being an adult, you already, for boys, it was, as I remember well, 12 years old, and for girls, it was 14 years old. And this relation between, let's say, age and social relations, they have always went in a process of changing. So it means that it could be interesting to see to this kind of, let's say, experience in order to question how the way we not only relate to people that are younger than us, but also to each other. So if I have to answer to the question, so if it's possible, basically to make it more abstract, to do nothing today, probably if we have to have moment of boredom, of nothing, it's something that is probably impossible to build individually. It's probably something that should be built for sure collectively. And considering this genericness of ways of living, where for everybody is impossible to do nothing, I think that the collective effort should include a large amount of people. A very big collective should effort in order to make this possible, probably. And I don't believe, I've read a lot of, let's say, there is also this Korean philosopher who talks about idiotism, which is being an idiot basically is a form of, let's say, retirement from reality. Even in philosophical terms, being an idiot means something positive. I still believe that being an idiot is still something negative, which means that retirement and going to do nothing alone is something impossible to do. Apart from if it is an example like the one Brian Eno was trying to experiment in himself when he said that I'm going to this countryside and to try to liberate myself from everything. But this is a more extreme scenario where I guess nobody could be able to do it so easily. So I think that, yes, this is more, let's say, a project. This could be a project that it is possible to build it only collectively.
I love that notion. I'd just like to say my boss is in the audience, and maybe this would be a lovely collective exercise to try. Yeah, so I would love to open the floor to questions, if anyone has a question to pose to Marson.
So maybe I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I mean, when you described this kind of furniture, this kind of object that colonized domestic space, I couldn't avoid thinking about a kind of role that the radicals attributed to furniture during the 60s. So do you think that, for example, this in a way terroristic or rebellious characteristic could be attributed to these kind of furniture nowadays? So could like a chaise-longue or these furniture that are made to do nothing could actually be, quoting the Archizoom, could again be proposed as weapons introduced into the realm of domestic space?
Yeah, I mean, we should be careful because, of course, the aim, if you want to, it depends on what we want to do. I mean, the idea for me is also a question of space. The idea that at a certain point it is impossible to put a chaise-longue in my room, for example. I have no space for putting a chaise-longue. And of course, it's something that, I mean, needs to, I also try to use the chaise-longue as I mean, I was trying to understand these days if it's possible and I have still to understand it, if it's possible to construct a story of the domestic space in general from the point of view of one specific object, no? Mm. And if you also have a look to the ways I try to show it, the object remains still the same, no? What changes is the space, the external space, or let's say the space where this object was, no? We started from the saloon, which was a sort of silver factory element. So I think that is the way that we try to understand space more than how we use the furniture, the furniture as a sort of, let's say, weapon or something like that. But, I mean, I really love the chaise-longue of Le Corbusier. I really feel a sort of, let's say, I would really fall in love if I would have a chaise-longue of Le Corbusier in my room, because I like this kind of shape. I know all the allegory behind it, but I would be just a bourgeoisie guy, if I propose this. So what I think that is important to understand is how is space that surrounds these objects changing, no? How the domestic space becomes smaller, how the domestic space becomes bigger, and how it becomes to be subdivided for a more hierarchical control between the family members, for example. So, and then we can use other objects to manifest probably a new way of living, liberated from these forms of hierarchy. Could be a chaise-longue, could be a bed, could be a new, let's say, form of using the bed, a new form of, it's a question of use and a question of space, in my opinion.
But is that perhaps the moment that it exits exactly that domestic setting? Because there's the whole idea of the idle wanderer, right? The notion of you can physically maneuver yourself to, not only let your mind wander, but that you are also physically wandering simultaneously.
Yes. In fact, it is interesting to understand, for example, for if I put a chaise-longue in the middle of of a loft, it is interesting to understand if daydreaming could be still possible or not, no? Mm-hmm. If you are full of people. But for example, I think that another activity, which I was also thinking this morning of daydreaming, which is very interesting, is daydreaming in the train. When you train, I'm not shy to say that when I'm in a train, I really daydream a lot. So this is why I said it's not related to a specific. Historically, apparently, it seems to be related to this object, but I think that could also be related to other objects, to other furniture, and yes, it depends which are the conditions, the social conditions that could release this kind of doing nothing.
Yeah, but actually it's Gideon himself who describes how the mechanics of the chaise-longue were applied then to, for example, railway seating.
Yes,
so the idea of this extremely domestic object that is being transposed into a mobility system.
Yes. I mean, for the modern architects, we know very well that train wagons have been very fundamental also for a theoretical point of view, even to justify, for example, the minimum dwelling concerns. And of course, Gideon mentions these train examples, which are very interesting. Of course, they are not chaise-longues; they are just they are, let's say, adjustable or elements. And he also mentions that what me makes also curious is this transformation of the chaise-longue that at a certain point becomes the chair at the barber and also the chair of the dentist. So the same chair that is used still by the dentist and by the barber when you go to cut your hair and you go to take away your tooth, it's like almost the same thing from the point of view of Gideon, and also from the point of view of this mechanization process started to be applied in more, let's say, other aspects, which is not only referring to domestic space.
Yeah, even office chairs, for example, all this idea of rotating chair, reclining chairs, regulating springs, mechanism, adjustability, then how it ended up becoming the American chair par excellence, which is the office chair. And I think this passage
yeah, it's one of the most perverse, because this is one of the situations where capitalism takes a lot of benefits for what is in our world called innovation. So any time that there is an innovation, then capitalism becomes a way to make people more smart, which in other words means also more productive. So yes, I mean, these are all examples, but I mean, for me, it's important how to reach this objective of having moments of daydreamings in our life.
Can I ask a question? I remove my headphone. Yeah.
No, it's okay. It's okay, Cyril. We can hear.
So you make a relation with daydreaming and going back into memory, child memory, when you talk about Proust and creativity. And when you show this room of Proust, I thought about the book of Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, which I ask you if it's the same idea of that in this book, the idea is that Judith Shakespeare, she couldn't be a writer because she didn't have a room for her. So is it true to say that this when you talk about the room and just say the chaise-longue has a close relation, and you need this in order to I would say to be really yourself, to do what you have to do, you know? Is it my question is that is it an object? Is it a room or just a chaise-longue that is needed to go into yourself and to really be yourself and be more creative?
Yeah. I mean, of course. This is a very important question because allows us to understand and to question as well. This, as I also tried to say before, this idea of the space that is surrounding this chaise-longue. No, I mean, the idea of being in a bed, being in a chaise-longue, or being in an armchair, where the only activity that you have to do is just thinking, is just laying in the, I mean, it's not nor a laying position nor a, let's say, sitting position. It's something in between that somehow the chaise-longue could make it possible because of its shape, because it is facilitating also this way of staying at home. But of course, it is also, on the other hand, what is also very important is also to have a space of enclosure for these activities. So the room could not be something to really avoid. Or I mean, I think that it could be very difficult for someone who wants to really to focus on his daydreamings, to be, for example, in a lofty space, no? Or in a space where there is a lot of noise, apart, as I said, as in the train or in the airplane, which is something still possible. So your question basically rises up, how do we? So the idea is, how do we still need the room, or we could let's say somehow try to escape from it. For example, when I showed the last image of this guy with the phone on the bedroom, on his bed, many times I also wondered and asked myself if today we can, for us, is enough just one single bed and that's it. So is it possible to say that today the most private space, unlike Virginia Woolf's or Marcel Proust's condition for writing, but today, is it possible to say that for us, for being creative, is enough having a bed and that's it? So this is a question to which I also try to answer this in my research, and to also to understand if private, I mean, if this idea of the daydreaming could also be a way to re-question the private limits, the limits of the private, or the limits of the individual, of the individuality. So yeah, I don't know. I think that, yeah, it's a question that needs.
Yeah, because you talk about collectivity, and so I didn't really understood what you mean by we think we now need to address this question more collectively. But because I have the feeling that is really the opposite. No? That daydreaming is really something is strictly personal and individual.
Yeah, yes, of course. I mean, as I also tried to say, daydreaming is something, as also Gaston Bachelard says, that it's an activity which can be done totally alone. But when I was talking about collectivity, I was referring also to the question of Teresa. So how is it possible to create moments in our life that could give us the possibility to daydream, no? And in a condition when everybody of us is put it to work constantly, in this, if you want to destroy or to change this kind of situation, is something that could be built only collectively. Not, I cannot think of an individual who, at a certain point, just escapes from society and then tries to close his bedroom and starts it to daydream, where at the same time is also the phone who's ringing all the time, and there is your boss or someone who's calling you because you're not answering the phone and all this kind of stuff. So I think that it's impossible to create a condition when the daydreaming or the idea of doing nothing could be possible today in the way we live. And I think that this is more a political question, is more a social question that should be built collectively. And turning back to your question, I think, yes, it's absolutely true that in order to be alone, to contemplate, to search in lost time and to search in the past, being alone is one of the most fundamental moments in life and for doing this kind of activity.
So we need a framework in order to make it possible.
Yes, I mean, this could be... But I don't know. I don't want to start a revolution today. It's just.
No, we don't. We don't have to. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I think we will call it a wrap. Thank you so much, Marson. This was a really insightful evening. It was a really fantastic fantastic talk. Thank you so much for being with us and preparing this for us.
Thanks.
And thank you everyone for being here. Have a good evening.